Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you're joining us from. I'm Bob Hamilton, Director of Eurasia Research, Head of Eurasia Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you to RSI. Thank you, audience members, and especially thank you, Bruce Pannier, for joining us today to talk about Russian and Chinese interests and interaction in Central Asia. This event is funded by the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command. The views expressed here do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. So, Bruce Pannier, our guest today, is a Central Asia Fellow in the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a longtime journalist and correspondent covering the region. He currently writes Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's blog on Central Asia and appears regularly on the Majlis podcast for RFERL. Prior to joining RFERL in 1997, Bruce worked at the Open Media Research Institute in Prague. In 1992, he led a sociological project in Central Asia, sponsored by the University of Manchester and the Soros Cultural Initiative Foundation. During that time, he lived in villages in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Bruce studied at Tashkent State University and also studied at Columbia University here in the US. Bruce has also written for The Economist, Jane's Intelligence, Oxford Analytica, Freedom House, The Cairo Review, FSU Oil and Gas Monitor, and Energo Weekly. Bruce, let me turn it over to you for some introductory remarks on our topic today, China and Russia in Central Asia.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the Foreign Policy Research Institute for inviting me to participate in this event. Thanks to everyone who's attending right now. And I'm looking forward to my discussion with Bob Hamilton in a few minutes, but I wanted to make some opening remarks that I hope will prove useful information for understanding how Russia and China view Central Asia and set the table for talking about how Russian and Chinese interests intersect and conflict in Central Asia since Russia launched its full-scale war in Ukraine in February 2022. And to do this, I'm going to start by going back a couple of millennia to the capital of China at the time, a city called Chang'an, which many of you know today as Xi'an. That's where the Central Asia Chinese Summit was held in May 2023. In 138 BC, Han Emperor Wu Ti sent an envoy to the western side of the Pannier Mountains to investigate rumors that the people living there were raising horses that were larger and stronger than the horses in China at the time. Wu wanted these horses for the army. The envoy that went was Chang Chen, and the story of his journey is one of the more remarkable tales of history, if for no other reason than Chang is surely one of the most devoted state servants who ever lived. I don't have too much time to talk about Chang. If you have a chance to visit, to look him up sometime, it's worth it to see his story. But I will mention he was captured and enslaved by Hunnic tribes on his way to Central Asia and on his way back. He carried out his mission and made contact with the people of Eastern Central Asia. 13 years after he left, Chang finally returned to Chang'an and reported what he saw, and that was the start of the Silk Road. And during the following centuries, China established trade with the peoples of Central Asia and at times even incorporated areas of what is now Eastern Central Asia into the Chinese Empire. Chinese imperial presence in Central Asia ended at the Battle of Talas, the Talas River in 751, when Arab forces expelled the Chinese from Central Asia and also brought and entrenched Islam into Central Asia. After 751, the Chinese never really had much influence in Central Asia until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia's first experience with Central Asia was entirely different. Peter the Great sent a military expedition to Khiva in 1717. The expedition was welcomed into Khiva, but then the Khivans turned on the Russians and slaughtered all of them. In 1839, Russian troops launched an unsuccessful campaign to conquer Khiva and avenge the killing of the Russian troops more than 100 years earlier. And the deaths of those Russian troops in the 18th century were still remembered when Russian forces finally seized Khiva in 1873. So the first Chinese encounter with Central Asia was about trade, and the first Russian encounter was about territorial conquest that ended in a disaster that Russians bitterly remembered many generations later. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in late 1991, the first of the newly independent states that China recognized and established diplomatic relations with were the 5 Central Asian states, all between January 2nd and January 6th, 1992. And I'll mention here real quickly that China had already established relations with Russian, Belarus, and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics in October 1949, and that recognition rolled over to the 3 countries after the fall of the USSR. So it might be natural that China would have chosen its Western neighbors to be the first countries that China gave extended diplomatic relations to after the fall of the Soviet Union. But I would also mention at this time that Russia was later with those diplomatic relations. In fact, it didn't get around to establishing diplomatic relations with Kazakhstan until October 1992. So returning to China and Central Asia, it was clear in the months after independence that China had mapped out plans for what cooperation with Central Asia would look like. When Turkmen President Saparmurat Niyazi visited China in November 1992, Chinese officials discussed the possibility of a natural gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to China. In August 1992, Kazakhstan and China agreed to build railway lines to connect the two countries and establish a border crossing at Porgos. And the topic of railway lines stretching across Central Asia toward Iran and Turkey was often on the agenda of Chinese officials in their meetings with Central Asian officials in the early 1990s. So we can see the blueprints for what will eventually become Belt and Road already being established in the first year that the Central Asian states are independent. Russia probably didn't welcome these contacts between China and Central Asia, and in the 1990s, Russia didn't welcome these contacts between China and Central Asia, but in the 1990s, Russia was in no position to do anything about it. There was also reason in the early 1990s to doubt that China could really carry out these. It seemed to me that some of the people in Russia thought that Central Asia would one day be under Russian rule again. And if the Chinese wanted to spend their money on improving infrastructure in Central Asia, that was simply less work and less expense for Russia when it finally reincorporated the territory into its empire. Now we'll move to the Shanghai Five because it's a pivotal moment. The Shanghai Five was established in April 1996. It's now known as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This was really a watershed moment for China's relations with Central Asia and the start of Russian concerns about Chinese influence in Central Asia, though no one really saw it at the time. The Shanghai Five were China and the four CIS countries that border China: Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The original objective of the Shanghai Five was the reduction of military forces along what had been the Sino-Soviet border. From the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union until the formation of the Shanghai Five, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan negotiated as a bloc on border issues with China. After the creation of the Shanghai Five, though, the three Central Asian states were left on their own and had to individually negotiate border issues with China. And so we see that all three of them later ceded territory to China. The success of the Shanghai Five in confidence building measures along their common border was so great that it led the group to expand their cooperation into economics and trade. So we see now that already in 1997, Kazakhstan and China signed a deal to build a pipeline to carry oil from Western Kazakhstan to China. And that really opened the floodgates on Chinese investment in Central Asia. By the time Xi Jinping visited Kazakhstan in 2013, said the words Belt and Road from Turkmenistan, all leading to China. The global economic crisis of 2007, 2008 was a huge setback for Russian efforts to compete financially with China in Central Asia. And the plummet in oil and gas prices in 2014, 2015 dealt Russia another financial blow in its ambitions in Central Asia. China was able to remain a stable partner in Central Asia through both these periods and then further entrenched Chinese financial influence in Central Asia. A little bit about security, and I know we're going to speak more about this during this conversation, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for a while did conduct large-scale military drills. In the first decade of this century, there was some that involved many thousands of troops, hundreds of military vehicles and assets, but Russia finally caught on to that, finally figured out that maybe they were getting muscled out of this situation by the SCO. So they really started to push on the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are all members of, as the guarantor of security in Central Asia. And although SCO military exercises do still continue, they're at a much lower scale, much smaller scale than they were. And they're not as frequent as they were either. Whereas the CSTO exercises happen sometimes several times a year. They're in Central Asia, in all the Central Asian member states all the time. So it kind of showed that Russia but this was at least an example of Russia pushing back on what it felt was too much Chinese security influence and military influence in Central Asia, and trying to establish new borders in what the Chinese Russian relationship was vis-a-vis Central Asian interests. And to sum it up, because I want to get to the talk here real quick, China basically views Central Asia as a resource base, and this is pretty much the way that they viewed Central Asia when Wu Ti sent Jiang Qian out there years and years ago. Russia, on the other hand, still views, a lot of people in Russia certainly still view Central Asia as really part of Russia's territory. It's territory that Russia conquered in the past, and for the moment, these lands are lost to Russia, but ultimately, and you can see this, and we'll also talk about this too, but you can hear this in comments from Russian officials that one day this territory will be returned to Russia, and that all these Central Asian states will again be part of the Russian Empire, the same way that Peter the Great looked at it 300 years ago, and the same way the czars of Russia looked at it in the 18th century when they finally conquered the area. I'm going to leave it here because I know we got a great discussion coming up, and I want to get to talking to Bob's, but thank you very much for giving me the introductory remark.
So, Bruce, thanks so much for those remarks. A fantastic overview. I got to admit, when you started in 138 BC, I was skeptical that you'd get to the present day in 10 minutes, but you pulled it off. So thanks very much for that. So for the audience members, please put any questions in the chat as soon as they pop into your head, and as soon as Bruce and I have a few questions for Bruce. It's a sort of moderator's prerogative, and then we'll get to the Q&A in the chat. So let me approach this from the perspective of just pure material or national security economic interests. So where are Chinese and Russian interests in Central Asia most aligned? What are the things they agree about the most when they look at Central Asia?
Well, I think first is security. All right, Central Asia obviously borders Afghanistan. It's got majority Muslim population in Central Asia. It's the northernmost expansion of the Islamic world, really, at that part. So that's one thing that the Chinese and Russians have always been worried about, is making sure that Islamic extremists do not get any footholds in Central Asia, since it's on both their doorsteps. So they've done what they can to prop up the governments in those regions. And we know Russia has three military bases in Central Asia, one in Kyrgyzstan, two in Tajikistan. The Chinese actually have a very small base way in the remote eastern mountains of Tajikistan, which is also near the Afghan border. But this just shows that they really want to keep the presence of Islamic extremism, radical Islam, out of that area. And hand in hand with that goes preservation of the current regimes in the area too. They don't want to see the regimes be changed and in some very different form of government emerge in that. And of course, Kyrgyzstan's had 3 revolutions since 2005. This is very unnerving to both Russia and China at the same time. One, because it could lead to instability and create the kind of threats we were just talking about with Islamic groups. I suppose equally, if some of these countries also follow suit, the Kyrgyz model, you could have a government that was much more Western leaning, more democratic, which would be a bad model for both dissident movements inside Russia and China to look at and maybe emulate. So they really want the status quo in Central Asia, and which is nominally secular governments, whether they're despotic or authoritarian is inconsequential. The main thing is that they keep tight control over what happen in those regions, which could prove a bad precedent for, again, not just Russia and China, but also neighboring areas, states, countries that border Russia or China, and what might happen there. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. You hear them talk a lot about the 3 evils of terrorism, separatism, and religious extremism, right? Almost any Chinese or Russian government statement or any SCO summit communique lists the 3 evils. And then I've started to hear a lot. You always heard it from the Russians, but I'm hearing it more and more from the Chinese, the color revolution phobia, right? And you spoke to that, right? The idea that there will be some sort of extra constitutional, outside of the normal constitutional process, there'll be a change in government. So yeah, it's really interesting. And what do you think are their interests aligned over the Western role in the region? Do they both sort of have the same interest in keeping us out, or is one more fixated on that than the other?
I mean, definitely. You know, one of the things about 9/11, when the United States and its NATO allies started using bases and actually just strengthening their relations across the board with the Central Asia, this was also something that neither Russia or China appreciated very much. Certainly in the Chinese case, remembering that, of course, the U.S. was using the Manas base, which is not so far from the Chinese border. So planes landing and taking off from that area probably had visual on Chinese territory when they were up. And both Beijing and Moscow were willing to at least understand the U.S. position at the start. In the first few years after this, it kind of wore out very soon, and they really started to worry that about this U.S. and NATO presence that was, again, right on their doorstep. Even if it was in the end preventing problems in Afghanistan from spilling out into Central Asia, it was unwelcome for the U.S. to be in Central Asia. And especially in the first years when the war was being, or at least the military operation was fairly effective. And it looked like Afghanistan might actually turn the corner and resume, become a peaceful country again. You know, how long would the effects of that linger in Central Asia? Would they look to the West as being someone, as Ruslan Karimov said early on in the campaign, that America had actually done what nobody else was able to do? They'd removed the threat of the Taliban from the Central Asian border, and as for having taken away, removed this concern from their own border. And I've argued, in the past that actually the Central Asians benefited probably more than anyone else, considering the way Afghanistan ended up considering where the foreign presence ended up in 2021. But for 20 years, they were shielded from the threat of the Taliban, and which was a huge concern for them in the late 1990s. So they were able to go about their business and pay much less attention to border security than they had been in the 1990s, especially post 1996 when the Taliban came to power in Kabul. And everyone in Central Asia, with the exception of Turkmenistan, was panicking. So, China and Russia both glad to see the U.S. Gradually ejected from Central Asia. Andijan in 2005, the massacre in Andijan was the first moment where we saw where Russia and China really didn't want the U.S. to be in there, because when the SCO meeting was held shortly after the massacre in Andijan, then both China and Russia backed Uzbekistan's call for the U.S. to set a timetable for when it was going to leave the Hanabad Karshi base in southern Uzbekistan, and it did so before the end of 2005, as a matter of fact. But that was really the start of China and Russia really pressuring the Central Asians to get the Americans to say something about how long they expected to be there, and preferably to start planning their departure from Central Asia so that they wouldn't have all these military assets and presumably reconnaissance and spying assets too, right there especially near the Chinese border, but also not far from the Russian border. And it would remove the influence, that Western influence from Central Asia besides.
Okay. So we're getting a lot of really good questions in the chat. So I had several, but I'll only ask one more, and then I want to get to the questions in the chat. And it's sort of the inverse of the first question I asked about their interests. So over what issues are their interests misaligned? Where is there possible divergence of Chinese and Russian interests in Central Asia?
I'm going to go back to what I said in the introductory remarks. I think the way that they look at Central Asia is fundamentally different. China doesn't want, at least for now, it hasn't shown any signs that it wants any Central Asian territory. In fact, why would it at the moment, right? Considering the situation in Xinjiang and the campaign that the Chinese are waging there, it's hard to imagine that China would want to incorporate another Muslim area into a greater Chinese empire. Russia is just the opposite. I mentioned that if you watch Russian TV and if you read their press, you will easily find people, including Russian officials, who will refer to Central Asia as being historic Russian lands. Kazakhstan bears the brunt of that, but we've also seen this in the case of Uzbekistan more recently. China's invested billions of dollars in Central Asia to develop this network to get resources out of Central Asia to China. The thought that Russia would be able to just take that, and essentially nationalize it, right? It would become Russian property at that point. That means that all that money would go right down the drain, and it also put in jeopardy the supply line for resources that China has established out there. Now, Russia, on the other hand, looks at it from, again, believing that Central Asia should belong to Russia at one time or another, is very concerned about Chinese playing along with these new trade routes. They're saying, the trade routes through Russia, the so-called Northern Corridor, have sanctions on them. So the Central Asians, although they're still using this, are looking for alternative ways to conduct trade, and not just the Central Asians, but China. So now we have the Middle Corridor, right? The China to Europe through Central Asia. China is promoting this route. There's a lot I could say about how this route developed, but I'll just leave it at the fact that China is supporting this route, which works to the detriment of Russia, right? So they're trying to establish a trade route that avoids Russian territory entirely. And while it's nowhere near being on the level of substituting for the Northern Corridor through Russia, I mean, it's made a lot of gains in just in 2 years. So this is clearly something that Russia doesn't particularly appreciate either. It kind of plays into the hands of the West at that point. So I would say those are two glaring examples of what the problem is in the way that China and Russia see Central Asia, and the role, and what Central Asia's role should be for their interests in the future.
Thanks, Bruce. So let me get to the first question in the Q&A from Mark Katz. Does Russia's involvement in Ukraine lessen its ability to influence Central Asia? Do Central Asian states and China fear that a Russian victory in Ukraine would lead to renewed and unwelcome Russian attention to Central Asia? So two-part question. Is the Ukraine war eroding Russian influence in Central Asia? And then I guess the flip side of that coin is, what if Russia wins? What do the Central Asian states and China perceive the effects of that would be?
Yeah. I would say it had to erode Russia's influence to some extent, and I mentioned in the paper too that I hope I mentioned in the paper, but after the Ukrainian war started, in 2022, you had like 1 million Russian citizens transit through Central Asia on their way out. Right, they were fleeing mobilization, maybe they were against the war, but they left. Even in the history of Central Asia, there's never been 1 million people that pass visually. To see that many Russians leaving sends a message to the Central Asians about what is happening in Russia and how popular is this war now. Also the Russian military strategists and officials had led everyone to believe that this would be a very quick war. Here we are, more than 2 years later, and they're still fighting this war. Now, that raises some doubts, especially, and some huge concerns in Central Asia about Russia's military capabilities. Russia has been, and I know we're going to talk about this in a while too, but Russia has been looked at as the guarantor of security, right? I mentioned bases in Central Asia, CSTO, even countries that aren't in the CSTO have always looked at Russia as being the ultimate source of aid if there were faced such security challenges that the regimes were in danger of going down, that they would appeal to Russia, and that Russia would send troops or some kind of military help, and it would prop them up. So this is, that's already one problem that's created and has lessened Central Asia's dependence. They've taken steps to shore up their own security outside of help with Russia. Economic help, obviously Russia's pouring most of its money now into this campaign, this so-called special operation that has going in Ukraine. Doesn't have the kind of money to spend in Central Asia that it had before. Lately, it hadn't had so much, but there were days where Russia was going around and signing contracts, multi-billion-dollar contracts with the Central Asians. So, that's also another concern, is what will happen. Will Russia ever be in economic shape to be able to play a significant role in Central Asia? Russia still is a leading trade partner with all the Central Asian countries. That's true. But we see a lot of other countries that were on the margins that are starting to make a lot of inroads in Central Asia too. All these things put together, plus, again, the chauvinist, jingoist comments that they get from Russia. Lately, the treatment of migrant laborers after the Crocus City Hall attack, this is something not only that they see on TV, but they got, remembering that Central Asians, extended families in Central Asians and Central Asia talk a lot. Now they have maybe by the estimates of how many Central Asian migrant laborers there are in Russia, they range from 4 million to 8 million, but they're calling home and telling people what the situation is, out there, and that they're afraid to leave their house, and that they've heard of people getting beaten that were Central Asians and stuff. I mean, this also cuts into Russia's image in Central Asia too. Now we'll get to the second part of the question, which is what happens if Russia wins the war in the Ukraine? Now this is of course for many Central Asian governments, probably of all of them, and certainly for many Central Asian peoples, a nightmare scenario. Again, Russian officials have already mentioned that they consider, including Putin. Putin said that he considers historical Russian lands to be all the territory of the former Soviet Union, right? So right now they're occupied in Ukraine. That's where their attention is focused. If they win, and they don't have to worry about Ukraine so much anymore, then where will they turn their attention next? I mean, Kazakhstan, as I said, has been singled out several times as a country that where there was nobody, supposedly no one was living in the north. It was totally unsettled until Russia came in. Even the head of the Russia's Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, had mentioned just before the start of the war in Ukraine, the full-scale war in Ukraine, that northern Kazakhstan should all be turned over to Russia, and that Russia should claim the uranium mining industry in Kazakhstan. And of course, Kazakhstan's the leading producer of uranium in the world right now. Baikonur, the Cosmodrome, should be returned to Russia. On and on it goes with this stuff. China clearly doesn't appreciate that. And remember when Xi Jinping visited Kazakhstan for the SCO summit in 2022. It was his first trip since the COVID pandemic. But one of the first things he did when he got to Kazakhstan and got off the plane was to say that China guaranteed the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Kazakhstan. It was a message that was repeated to other Central Asian countries too. So this is China kind of throwing down the gauntlet at this point and basically saying this is our red line, is that we will not sit back and watch while Russia reconquers these territories, particularly Kazakhstan, which is of course a key country, both for Russia and China. But in terms of trade, China's dumped more money into Kazakhstan than any other Central Asian country, because that is the big country and has pretty much everything on China's list of resources. And China's spent a lot of money again to develop these resources and get them to China. So you can't imagine that China would just sit there and watch Russia mass troops on the Kazakh border and not send messages to Moscow that this was going to be a huge problem.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruce. Let me get to the second question from Shabnam Yusuf. What are the major U.S. concerns in South and Central Asia after a decade of BRI evolution as a power projection project?
Oh, well, this is interesting. The U.S. is kind of rebooting. I know that's been used a lot, but kind of rebooting its relations with Central Asia. I mean, it always did have a presence, and I always thought, and I was in Central Asia a lot in the 1990s, and the U.S. influence in Central Asia was substantial, and it was growing all the time. Different times for the U.S. economically and politically, without a doubt, but there certainly is still a U.S. interest in Central Asia, both in terms of security and now in terms of business. Critical raw materials is something. And remembering that the United States U.S. company Chevron is a major player in Kazakhstan with the oil market out there. That they do have a car manufacturer, was it Ford or Chevrolet? I can't remember anymore. That has a car manufacturing plant in Uzbekistan. There's been a lot of not huge American investment in Central Asia, but I mean targeted American investment in Central Asia too. So the U.S. doesn't want to lose the influence that it has since the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan and left, particularly the way that the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan and left that area. The U.S. again trying to rebuild some of the confidence, still helping with security in Central Asia, still interested in helping Central Asia remain sovereign and independent from Russia, which is something the Central Asians can appreciate and embrace. But they had Ambassador U.S. Ambassador Rosenblum. He's currently the ambassador in Kazakhstan. He was the ambassador in Uzbekistan, but a couple months ago, he was at a panel and they said, someone asked, what's your interest in the middle corridor? And he said, well, the U.S. interest in the middle corridor is minimal at this point, because it's really not something that the U.S. has. The U.S. doesn't gain from this substantially. However, the U.S. is certainly supporting the middle corridor, one, because it's a way of, again, prying Central Asia a little bit further away from Russia, and also it helps the U.S. European allies out there. So I think the U.S. is still a player in Central Asia. It also sends the same message about sovereignty and territorial integrity that the Chinese have been doing. This is welcome. The U.S. is a superpower, the superpower, if you will. So U.S. support for maintaining your own independence is nothing to shy away from, but on the Central Asian point of view. But I think we're going to have to face the fact that it's kind of a new game, and I know we're going to talk about some of this as we diverted with Ukraine. We have a lot of different people that are showing up in Central Asia. It's not just the Chinese, and it's not just the U.S., and it's not just the Europeans. You have you have Turkey that's also upped its role in Central Asia. You have the Arab states that have upped their role in Central Asia at the same time. Their consideration and respect for democratic values are not the same as Western democratic values, right? So the Central Asians, when they're trying to balance their foreign policy, if the U.S. or some Western government or Western organization, institution, whatever, starts to preach to them about democratic values or respect for human rights, they have a multitude of partners now who will tell them they don't have to listen to that. So it's a very interesting and complicated balancing act for countries like the United States and Europe at the moment, where they still want to have a hand in Central Asia geopolitically. Obviously, it's important. Iran's there, Afghanistan's there, China's there, Russia's there. So they want to make sure that they still have connections out there. They want to have access to some of the resources that Central Asia has, but you're going to have to be very cautious about prompting the Central Asians to have greater respect for human rights and try to make some progress on democratic reforms. So it's a different game than the last 30 years.
Yeah, Bruce, it's interesting because I think we often do this. We're talking here about Russian-Chinese interests in Central Asia, and naturally the discussion turns to other great power interests or even middle power interests in Central Asia. But we shouldn't forget that it's more than a playground for great power interaction. These countries have agency. They have their own interests, and they're often able to play the external actors off against each other to assert their own interests. I use this all the time, a quote that from you from a few months ago. You said the 5 Central Asian presidents are like a rock band on tour, right? They've been welcomed in pretty much every European and Asian capital over the last year or two. So let me get to the next question from Leonard Hill. How does or how will Russia's growing dependence on China since February 2022 affect their interaction in Central Asia?
So I think this is one of the more interesting aspects of Russian-Chinese relations. We know historically that Russian-Chinese relations are not good. I'd mentioned what happened with the Russians in Khiva in the early 18th century, but if you know the history of the first contact between the Russians and the Chinese and what's now Khabarovsk, it also ended very, very badly. So this is really a relationship of convenience. I've always thought that way. Russia has had to lean on China a lot more in the last couple of years, not only as a market to replace the market that they lost in Europe, but also for obviously for diplomatic support, votes in the United Nations, things like that. So they have a very curious relationship where it's kind of like two guys shaking hands and the free hand that they have behind their back has a knife in it. They need each other for the moment. Russia needs China more than China probably needs Russia. But for political support and again, diplomatic foreign policy support, they do kind of need each other for right now, and we'll see how far that goes. Clearly China has its eye on Taiwan. So in any case, it really couldn't criticize Russia for its campaign in Ukraine, no matter how inconvenient that might be. at the same time, Russia is not going to China is not going to bail Russia out of this. How many times has Russia offered to sell, that Russia would love to sell more gas, more oil, more everything to China that it could, but the Chinese have kept a limit on that, right? Sila-Sibir, the second gas pipeline to China has been stalled endlessly. So that's the Chinese obviously showing that they're not really that interested in buying that much more Russian gas. China's kind of gone along with the sanctions, not entirely. Again, still to prop up Russia, but how they go forward, since is going to be really interesting. I mentioned Xi Jinping had kind of thrown down the gauntlet when he got to Kazakhstan by saying that China respected the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Kazakhstan. Clearly this is a sign that appreciate Russian irredentism, and they don't want to see that happen. At the same time, and I know this is something else we're going to talk about. At the same time, we've talked about, and a lot of people have talked about Russia as in the role of the guarantor of security, China as being the banker of Central Asia. China does not want to be the guarantor of security in Central Asia. They would help out to the greatest extent possible. If it looked like the Central Asian governments were going to go down, especially if there was some threat of Islamic extremists carving out a foothold in the area. But it's very difficult for me to imagine Chinese troops actually on the ground in Central Asia. It would create a number of problems for China instantly. So they really want, to some extent, they really want Russia to still be this guarantor of security. If there's a problem in Central Asia, a serious security problem, that Russia should send its troops to work it out. The thought of sending Chinese troops again create havoc, huge amount of problems in Central Asia, make China a magnet for Islamic extremists instantly, and Chinese assets, not so much China itself, but Chinese assets abroad would be fair targets for a number of groups at that point. So they would prefer that Russia still keeps its security military presence in Central Asia and is in the end the ultimate guarantor of security in Central Asia. So like I said, it's a very strange dance that they're doing. China doesn't want to, will act as the policeman if needed in Central Asia. And I hope that kind of answered the question. I know it's a complicated relationship they have.
Yeah, sure. No, you're right. And many of these questions, this next one included, we could do an entire event or seminar on. So next one's from Joseph Della Pena. How closely do the borders in the region correspond with the linguistic or ethnic boundaries?
As someone who, again, you mentioned the start, when in 1992 and 1993, I traveled all over there. It was a great opportunity where no one was actually, there were no borders in Central Asia when I got there in 1992. And I can remember the first time I had to actually go through a border checkpoint in late 1992, which was essentially a card table with two Uzbek guys on the Uzbek side of the Kyrgyz Uzbek border. And when you would travel around, just because of the Soviet Union, and even prior to the Soviet Union, because these were emirates and Khanates in Central Asia, were much like the Soviet Union, the major identity of the people was what Khanate or emirate they were in. Now, their ethnic identity was secondary, the same way it was in the Soviet Union, right? Your ethnicity was secondary to the fact that you were a citizen of the Soviet Union. So that people were mixed all over the place. The Fergana Valley is the extreme example of that, where they're all over. You can go into one village in any one of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, or Uzbekistan and find all three peoples there. The Sok Enclave it's part of Uzbekistan, but it's surrounded by Kyrgyzstan, is inhabited almost entirely by Tajiks. I've spent time there, right? So this is the kind of situation you got. Now, since the Soviet Union fell apart, and these countries actually emerged for the first time, now we have Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Those borders have started to take on more importance. There is a legitimacy to that now. A lot of people have moved from wherever they were to the country that bears their name. If you were Uzbek and you were in Kyrgyzstan, maybe you moved to Uzbekistan. If you were Kazakh and you were Uzbek in Uzbekistan, you moved to Kazakhstan. So you've had a lot of shuffling around of some of those people. A lot stayed where they were, but you have had people actually move to the country that has the title of their ethnic group on it. So the borders have assumed more significance and actually more reflect the ethnicity, the ethnic breakdown than they did in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce. So next question comes from Samuel Rotenberg. How do you see the Central Asian countries balancing? They don't want to be dependent on Russia or China, but geography tends to push them that way. Is there a chance for them to reorient more towards the West, India, Pakistan, or other actors?
Yeah, I think if it was possible, I think the Central Asians would reorient toward anyone who could fulfill the roles that China and Russia play right now. You know, China and Russia, for all the things that China and Russia have done for Central Asia, and I know that the Central Asians would disagree that they've done very much, but there are some things that they've certainly some significant things that both Russia and China have contributed to Central Asia. But they're both big neighbors, and the Central Asians have in the mind of Central Asians, their history with both of them is bad. They remember the bad experiences they've had. They were colonized by Russia, right? That they were you know, again, millennia ago, parts of Central Asia were colonized by the Chinese. In the meantime, the Chinese are this monster country now, you know, monster in the terms of just being huge with a huge population. And one day, if the population gets too big to be contained in China, then where do they expand into? And, you know, a lot of people in Central Asia think that that's going to be where they go, is into Central Asia. So if they could find someone that could fulfill the economic security and other roles in Central Asia that China and Russia are performing right now, they certainly would accept that. And in fact, we see signs of that right now. We can get into that more if you want. You know, at the end of the day, the fact is that those are their neighbors. And the further away they could possibly pull from both of them, the better off they would probably feel. But the phrase that Nazarbayev was the first one to use it, but I think that all the Central Asian leaders at one time or another have said, Russia or China is a neighbor given to us by God. Now you can interpret that a lot of ways, but I interpret that as meaning there's nothing we can do about it. Mm-hmm. They're there, you know, geographically. This is what we have to deal with. So the Central Asians would like to be secure in as many ways as possible from any threats or pressure from both China and Russia. The fact is that both China and Russia have exerted and continue to exert a huge amount of influence in Central Asia. Both China and Russia are willing to provide Central Asian states with things or support. So you know, the situation is changing very, very slowly at the moment, but for the foreseeable future, this is, you know, it's the hand that they're dealt, and they're just going to have to deal with Russia and China to the best of their ability, and hopefully end up by maintaining their independence, their sovereignty, and territorial integrity.
Okay. So the next question comes from Jeff Lilly. How are the Central Asian countries balanced maintaining their important economic relations with Russia while insisting on their sovereignty, especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine?
You know, I think China kind of cracked the door open for that when they started their investments in the late 1990s. That Russia has kind of, you know, grudgingly had to accept this. You know, Russia still has a lot of influence merely or simply from the fact that so many of the infrastructure connections leading out of Central Asia are going through Russia, because of course it was part of Tsarist Russia, and then it was part of the Soviet Union. So all the roads led to Moscow, so to speak, right? That's not going to change for a long, long time. We've talked about the middle corridor, and I mentioned that the northern corridor, the one that goes through Russia, still can carry a lot more situation for a long, long time. Added to that, the Central Asians know the Russians that they're dealing with. They understand if they send something by rail and it has a problem in Russia, they know who to call to find, you know, why is my cargo being held up? When can I expect it to this other place? So there's a lot of different connections that keep them tied with Russia, and Russia understands this too, right? That's why I think that, you know, as much as there's concerns about people making inroads in Central Asia recently, or the Chinese making inroads in Central Asia for the last 25 years, there is also this level of comfort among many officials in Russia that it's impossible for the Central Asians to totally detach from Russia. And you know, even to things like well, look at northern Kazakhstan. They just had at the start of this last winter, when they had electricity problems in northern Kazakhstan, and some of the power plants started to fail again, which were Soviet era power plants, but they started to fail and they had problems. The electricity lines run across the Kazakh-Russian border all over the place. So Kazakhstan immediately turned to Russia and said, "Can you please send them more electricity?" Gas that's produced in northern Kazakhstan in the west goes to Orenburg and places in Russia to be processed and then resent and sent back to Kazakhstan again. Petroleum products in and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, almost more than 90% of their petroleum products come from Russia. Russia owns the gas company in Kyrgyzstan. You know, it goes on. And now, of course, more recently, we've seen the fact that I'd mentioned Kazakhstan and its electricity problems, but Kazakhstan also has a gas shortage problem. So does Uzbekistan, and they've turned to Russia to buy gas, where once both were exporting gas to Russia. Now both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are looking at it strengthens the connections between Russia and the future.
Okay, thanks. So Bruce, the next question is from Roxana Gabidulina. Can you talk about Chinese and Russian political or narrative or informational influences in Central Asia? The leaders of the countries tend to think protests are all foreign funded. And then also the question talks about Chinese influence in terms of sort of smart cities. I would add digital authoritarianism. So how are Russia and China influencing the political, the narrative in Central Asia?
You know, they can certainly put the pressure on the Central Asians if they perceive that the Central Asian governments are making moves that are run counter, are detrimental to Chinese or Russian interests in the region. And there's a number of examples I can give on this. I think the one in terms of Russia, again, and I don't want to keep using Kazakhstan as an example. There's other ones, but the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, right? That you know, Kazakhstan exports more than 80%, roughly 80% of its oil exports go via this pipeline to Russia's Black Sea port at Novorossiysk. Now, in the early days of the war, and in fact, in the early hours of Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, the Kazakh government said right away that they weren't going to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk, which Russia had just said should be recognized as sovereign countries. There have been a number of comments, including from President Tokayev, about you know, respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity. You know, again, not giving any political support to any of these separatist regions that Russia's carved out in eastern Ukraine. I mean, it was pretty clear that the government didn't support what was going on. Now, you know, once they started making those comments, all of a sudden in 2022, you have 4 different times during the course of the year, they had to shut down operations or temporarily suspend operations at the port in Novorossiysk. By some estimates, by Kazakhstan's own estimates, actually, they had lost at least $330 million because they couldn't ship their oil through the Novorossiysk port on to customers who mostly are in the European Union. You know, but this is a message from Moscow. You don't support us in the war in Ukraine. In fact, you're going to publicly make comments that don't directly criticize, but obliquely criticize what's going on in Ukraine, then we can also make life rough for you in the meantime. China, of course, is the leading creditor to most of the Central Asian countries at this point. So if there's any problems with, if their policies in Central Asia run counter to Chinese interests, China can call in the loans, they can withhold money that's being used to withhold loans that they don't have to publicly make a demonstration of this. They can very quietly explain that if you are going to allow people to demonstrate against Chinese policy in Xinjiang, then we're going to suspend or temporarily withhold our loan for the east or the north-south road in eastern Kyrgyzstan, thermal power plants that they're building all over Central Asia at the moment. Pipelines that people want, Turkmenistan, especially gas pipeline D, which has been suspended. The construction of that's been suspended for 7 years now, say 7 or 8 years now. But they have a number of levers they can pull on this to get the Central Asians to come around and make sure there's no expressions of anti-Chinese sentiment. Not that this would come from the government, but it would come from the societies and the people in these countries if the Central Asian governments were to loosen up controls on public protests. So this is something that clearly China has signaled to the Central Asians. We don't want to see anti-Chinese sentiment. There has been very few, very small flashes of this in Central Asia, and they've pretty much been shut down very, very quickly. And one would just expect that that was partially because they got a call from Beijing saying this looks bad and we don't want to see it anymore.
So Bruce, you're popular today. We've got 12 more questions to get to and 10 more minutes. We can go over a little bit if we need to, because I would like to get to all the questions. But I'm going to combine a few questions that are related. So first, these are sort of the flip side of a coin. From Wolf, is there a potential for the U.S. to drive a wedge between Russia and China and Central Asia? And then second part of that question from Gabriel Harper, any overt displays of displacement of Western influence in Central Asia by Russia and China?
There's so many variables about this. If you'd asked me about Western influence on September 10th, 2001, I would have said that there wasn't that much opportunity for the United States to have a serious military presence in Central Asia or to be a huge security player in Central Asia. But obviously that changed. Understanding that the West is not going to spend a huge amount of money in Central Asia. And I know that the European Union just unveiled its $10 billion investment program in Central Asia, which was a step in the right, through the eyes of the Central Asians, this is a step in the right direction. This is what they want to hear. This is why they like going to China, right? The Kazakh president goes to China and they say at the end of it that we've signed deals worth $20 billion. Most of those deals probably won't ever be realized, but the main thing is that they're able to grab the headlines and say, this is attractive to even the people that don't like Chinese influence because it also says that they're going to create jobs in Central Asia. And that, whatever country signed all these deals personally will get something out of this. And I know this from seeing Chinese road crews, which move through Kyrgyzstan, where when they approach a village or a town in Kyrgyzstan, all the people in that town or village are real happy with Chinese all of a sudden, right? Because they think that maybe there's a chance they can get jobs. And then when the Chinese reach that area and they have to hire local people, the people that are hired are very grateful to the Chinese and have nothing but good things to say about them. Now that now 6 months have passed and the Chinese are 30 kilometers down the road and you talk to the same people and then they have nothing but bad things to say about the Chinese. But so it really comes down to economics and monetary interests on a personal level. The West isn't going to do that. Now, will the situation change? Will there be a security problem that maybe the West can help out with? Will there be an economic problem that only the West is willing to help out with? That I cannot foresee what that would be, but these kind of things could change the situation as it stands right now. Understanding that for the United States and for Europe, Central Asia is one region of many that they're dealing with and spend their money on and their attention on. There's not much chance that the situation as it stands right now is going to change. I don't see where it's really in the interest. Even when I was living in Central Asia in the early 90s and people were saying, oh, we're going to be great friends in the villages. We're going to be great friends with America. They're going to come in and defend us against Russia reconquering us. And I would make the point that America is literally on the other side of the planet, and American interests are all over the world. And Central Asia is only one place. So it really is a prioritization at that point. Well, how important is it to come in and help the Central Asians out with this problem or with that problem? How much money are we really going to spend on this problem or that problem in Central Asia? Understand that we also have commitments other places, which is why I say I don't see that the status quo as it is going to change anytime soon, unless something incredibly unexpected happens.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about sort of perceptions of the U.S. and having to sort of remind people that the U.S. is on the other side of the world and is a global power with global interests. And our FPRI colleague, Nick Vosdev, has used the term, says American policymakers and diplomats sometimes use promiscuous language, which I love the term, because language designed to make some countries feel good, but also has the unintended maybe effect of making them feel like they're more important than the U.S. interests than they are, and then they feel let down when the chips are down and we don't come through. So I've got 3 questions on India. I'll combine them. They all really revolve around what are India's interests, and Is India's influence rising in the region vis-a-vis, especially Russia and China?
I think anyone that spent a lot of time in Central Asia and spent time with the people there, India has always been one of the more interesting countries. The Central Asian people generally have a huge affection for India, right? Even during the Soviet days, right? And certainly when the Chinese-Soviet relations soured in the late 1950s, all of a sudden China was portrayed on Soviet television as the enemy. That's why you have these border defenses when the Soviet Union falls apart that they have to start talking about and everything like that. But India was an ally, was at least a friend of the Soviet Union, so that image didn't suffer at all. Bollywood, huge, in Central Asia. I mean, when you talk to the Central Asians about India, they smile and start telling you what they know about the music, the movies, all kinds of things. Which is exactly the opposite. They frown and go, "Oh, they're this, they're that," or Russia, "Oh, they exploit us, and this is what the history is." But India has a really good image in Central Asia. The problem is they're not directly connected with Central Asia, and this is a huge setback for India. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these stories that were there, and they still circulate every now and then. India is going to use a base in Tajikistan, or has rights to use a base in Tajikistan, right? The first time I saw this, I'm like, okay, that's great. And Indian troops are flying there through what? Through Pakistani airspace or Chinese airspace to get to Tajikistan. I'm like, neither one of these is a viable option. So how would India support troops or a base in Central Asia? They have to go, all the way around the globe practically to get in there without going through Pakistani or Chinese airspace. And you can imagine the reaction of Chinese or Pakistani militaries if they saw an Indian Air Force plane starting to come into their airspace. But that said, if there was a way for India to improve its connectivity to Central Asia, I think the Central Asians would be happy to see them come in, and they would flood in. That's why these tentative moves through Afghanistan to create some trade routes. The proposed railway line that would go, the Trans-Afghan railway line that would hook up to Pakistan and then by port over to India. If that could work, that would be huge. It would, obviously, this is a very small scale. It wouldn't move huge amounts of goods through there, but just in terms of public relations and diplomatic relations between India and Central Asia, it would be a huge event. But given the current geography of the area, India, as much as the Central Asians would like to see more of them, they have limited possibilities. Now, even that said, let's again look at the fact that India is buying uranium from Kazakhstan for its nuclear reactors. I mean, here's one area where they have mutual interest and they're able to conduct business together. So probably we'll see a lot more of that, but given the physical connections on the ground, which are hugely important for India and Central Asian relations, the limited physical connections, roads and railways, there's not much more that can be done at the moment to really open the doors to India or for India to Central Asia.
I'm going to combine the next couple of questions from Roxana Gabigulina and Gabriel Harper. They're both about China. So Roxana asks, do people in Central Asia see China as a potential hedge or an insurance policy against Russian hegemony or even aggression? And Gabriel asks, is there any attempt to moderate or limit Chinese influence and investment, or is it typically welcome with little restriction?
First, yes. I think that's really one of China's big cards right now. I didn't get enough time to deal with Chinese trade, but Chinese trade with Central Asia is still substantial, but it's flatlined essentially, right? They're still providing more money than almost anybody else, but they're not boosting their investment. I don't know if that's out of deference to Russia's situation where they don't want to make it look like they're taking advantage of Russia's distracted attention. But the fact is that China has not gone forward and all of a sudden started investing a lot more money in Central Asia. They've invested in the huge projects they wanted to. I mentioned the gas pipeline from Turkmenistan, oil pipeline from Tajikistan, roads, railways, all that's built. So that they're not going to boost their investment in there. But so when the Central Asians look at China and what it is as a partner, yes, it's still a leading investor, and I'll come to that again because that's the second part of the question. Value as a balance against Russian intentions, and it has gone up hugely since the war in Ukraine, full-scale war in Ukraine started. That this is one of the big benefits of a relationship with China is that if Russia starts to threaten or growl, the Russian bear starts to growl at Central Asia, you turn to the Chinese dragon, and I'm sorry for those tired cliches that have been used again and again of dealing with China now that the Central Asian Sea is that it is a balance against Russian irredentism. This idea of historic Russia, that they can use China, which is also a huge power, to play off against Russian threats at the same time. And I think, just as an aside with that, I would mention too that if anyone noticed at the start of last year, I think China started referring to cities in far eastern Russia, in Russia's far east. There was a list of 7 or 8 cities that they started referring to by the old Chinese names again. Right. So this is also symbolically, this kind of sends a message to Russia that if you're going to play this game, we also have claims on some of your territory. And I'm not trying to advertise, I just have a paper out with this, but the Arab states have come on strong on this. And I think this is much to very welcome in Central Asia. Again, Chinese investment in Central Asia is kind of flatlined. So they've been turning to the Arab states since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And, just a couple months, or I think March or I think it was late February, the Kazakh foreign minister went down to Qatar, and they announced that they had a $17.6 billion package of deals that they were signing. Right now, this is Chinese level deals. The kind of things we used to hear when Central Asian leaders would go to China and they'd say, "Oh, we got $20 billion worth of deals." When President Mirziyoyev, Uzbek President Mirziyoyev, went to Saudi Arabia in 1992, they also signed packages of deals worth $13.1 billion, right? So the Chinese are still investing, but now they got somebody else with money too. And they're putting up the same kind of numbers that China was putting up for years. So it'll be really interesting to see going forward if the Arabs aren't, I would argue that they're already competing with Chinese investment, and they might actually be able to move ahead of them in the coming years, since China has, again, I use the word flatline, but I have to be fair to China. And from their point of view, a lot of the money they've sunk into Central Asia in loans is never going to be repaid. And that's making them also reluctant to put more money into Central Asia. The money that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan owe China, very unlikely that either of those countries ever be able to pay that back. So now when China considers loaning money to Central Asian states for projects, they also have to consider, will they ever get this money back? Which is one of the things holding up this proposed China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan railway. It's a $6 billion project that neither Uzbekistan or China or Kazakhstan, or excuse me, neither Uzbekistan nor Kyrgyzstan have the money to pay for. So while it would benefit both Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan to build it, the Chinese are aware of the fact that they're going to have to foot the bill and depend on the fact that maybe someday down the line, these countries will be able to repay them.
Okay, so Bruce, we got 4 more questions. I can combine 3 of them into one because they're all about economic issues, and then there's one that has to stand on its own. I think we can get through these in 5 or 10 minutes. So let me give you the 3-part question on economics. The first part is, given the indispensable friendship between Russia and China, is Russia likely to renegotiate or to ensure the flow of oil and minerals and the safety of China's investments in regional infrastructure while still taking what it wants? So in other words, is there some sort of de facto Russian-Chinese economic partnership over Central Asia? The second part is, any thoughts on Russian supply of gas to China, and is that competing with the supplies of gas from Central Asia to China? And then the third part is water resources in the region.
Well, you gotta repeat that. The screen froze for a minute, so I missed about half that first question. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, so the first question, the first part, is essentially on, is there a Russian and Chinese condominium or de facto agreement where Russia will help ensure the flow of oil and minerals and the safety of Chinese infrastructure investments in the region while still ensuring it gets what it wants and needs? That was the first part, right? Second part is on gas. Russian gas to China, is it in competition with Central Asian gas to China? And then the third part is on water resources, and specifically, is it a tool or a means for Russia to influence or to have leverage in the region?
Oh, these are good questions. Okay. As far as China getting what it wants for resources, okay, this is also kind of complicated, but certainly, you know, since China has helped to build the infrastructure, it's expected that China's going to demand that they're getting the resources that they want out of Central Asia, both in terms of oil and gas. Understanding that Russia is a competitor for these resources too. Now, the good news, I suppose, for China is Russia doesn't need any of these things because Russia is itself a oil and gas exporter, right? So it's not like shipments from Central Asian oil or gas are being taken away from Russia's needs or anything. That's not the case at all. You know, again, they are Central Asia, as you mentioned, is competing actually with Russia in this. Now there's another aspect to this too, and it was interesting. This is not something that I came up with on my own. This belongs to a oil and gas expert named John Roberts, who's currently in Britain. But he mentioned that the Russia's use of the Central Asian gas pipeline down to get, and I won't get into that. It's not actually Russian gas at the moment, but Russia has signed contracts to export its gas to Central Asia. Now, the gas pipelines that that China helped build, funded from Turkmenistan to China, also in Uzbekistan, each have 10 billion cubic meters of gas allotted to them. They can ship China 10 billion cubic meters. Now, the fact that that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan can't provide for their own domestic needs at the moment and are having to import gas from Russia means that there's 20 billion cubic meters of spare capacity in these pipelines running from Turkmenistan to China. John Roberts, I thought interestingly, said that Russia might be looking at exporting its gas, the same gas that's going to be coming now towards Central Asia, could also go into trunk lines and link up with these pipelines from Turkmenistan to China and fill the spare capacity that Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are no longer able to fill themselves. It's an interesting thought. We'll see how that works out. But I think for now, obviously, again, Russia would obviously prefer that China was buying from it. Chinese policy is very prudent on this. It's diversification thing at all. So I think Russia's fooling itself if it thinks that it's going to get 60% of, or even 40% of the Chinese gas market, import market. That won't happen. That's not at all. Maybe they'll be able to boost it a little bit, but again, it's in China's inflation state stable, which means making sure that they have revenue so that they can keep their countries running, keep their people employed so that they don't have unrest break out in there too. So they're going to cling to these deals that they have with the Central Asians to the last moment. China would never cut off imports of Turkmen gas because that would leave Turkmenistan open to huge social problems because all of a sudden they wouldn't be bringing in revenue. Water is going to be really interesting going forward in the future. I don't know how much either Russia or China can do about that. Now, China, especially because China is going to be using some of the same water resources from the Tian Shan and Pannier Mountains for their own territory in Xinjiang province. How much they can cooperate with the Central Asians, I don't know. I would think if anything, they'd probably be accused of taking more water than they were supposed to, and this might actually create further problems in Chinese Central Asian relations. What Russia can do about the water problem, I don't know. Russia ultimately and the Soviet Union are responsible for the problems that have led to the drying up of the Aral Sea. More recently, the Caspian is going down. Is also reduced water in the Caspian Sea, and the Iranians just a month ago blamed Russia for overusing water from the Volga River for that. So I'm not sure what role Russia could play in this. There's these old river diversion schemes, Siberian river diversion schemes, which even the Soviet Union, who weren't very concerned about environmental consequences, but even then they dismissed these as being impractical and possibly dangerous, but they keep getting resurrected. Will they divert, oh, you're going to see water and bring it to Central Asia? I've heard even recently Russians argue that, look, you can either send the Central Asians water now, or they're going to dry up, and then you're going to have millions of migrants going north into Russia anyway.
Wow.
But again, I don't really see that China or Russia are in any position to help with the water problems in Central Asia. Past water conservation projects or renewable energy, and Russia is not big on renewables outside of nuclear. China has been helping out solar, wind, but that's really where the situation is right now. I don't see either one of those countries playing a big role in water conservation projects or desertification, remediation of land in Central Asia.
Mm-hmm. So, Bruce, it's great that you mentioned Turkmenistan in your answer to the last question, because it's actually the subject of this, our last question from Mickey Glantz. And he asks, is Turkmenistan the odd country out? And you mentioned most of the other four is of central concern to Russia and China.
Definitely. And it's really, it's frustrating. I was in Turkmenistan. I've been persona non grata there for quite some time, but I was there in 1992 and 1993, and it was the Turkmen people were really wonderful, but their government just seems to miss every single chance that it has to try to advance the country. Its economic interests. Okay, we're not asking for them to cast aside their policy of positive neutrality, whatever that means, or their isolationism, which is what positive neutrality really equates to. But you got to get in on some of these deals that are going on. The Middle Corridor, we mentioned that several times. Turkmenistan's still an outlier on this. The United Arab Emirates have been working on projects to get ports in the Persian Gulf through Iran, obviously. Turkmenistan really hasn't played any role in this at all. Kazakhstan's been the big one. Kuryk and Aktau on the Caspian coast. I mean, Abu Dhabi development of those two ports, but it's now building a shipbuilding and ship repair yard on Kazakhstan's Caspian coast, and they're doing they've got the whole chain now, so they can get the ports. They say in 3 days. Turkmenistan's missing out on this opportunity. They could have gone for a Trans-Caspian pipeline years ago when Russia. Now the opportunity is kind of lost at the moment. Certainly, it's something that Russia doesn't want to see built. Although, again, this is something that depends on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. If Russia was the loser, maybe that'll come up again. But they haven't really done much with that. They haven't figured out new export routes to get to the obvious customer in Europe who really wants to buy their gas. They're still talking about the TAPI pipeline, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, which has gone absolutely nowhere, in 30 years. I mean, it's a sign of how desperate Turkmenistan has become from its own mismanagement of business deals that the head of the Halk Maslahati, who's the former president of Turkmenistan, Gurbanguly Berdimuhammedov, was just in Tajikistan a couple of weeks ago peddling gas and oil there. Tajikistan is the poorest country in Central Asia. And this is what Turkmenistan is reduced to, right? That they're locked into long-term contract with China. They haven't built and are unwilling to put their own money up to build export routes to other countries. So their customers are China, where they have a fixed price. Russia, which not very small volumes, no more than 5 billion cubic meters, and certainly at a price that's 150 per thousand cubic meters or lower. I mean, I've heard even 110. So that's not a very good deal. They have swap agreements for very low amounts of gas with Iran that actually goes into Azerbaijan. So they've really missed the boat. Every chance they've had to do something to improve so it's really unfortunate, but it's a mismanaged country, and certainly the leadership are not very good businessmen. I think all their neighbors understand that and take advantage of them every chance they get.
So thanks, Bruce. We'll leave it there. So first, thank you to RSI for sponsoring this event. Thanks to FPRI for organizing it. Thanks, audience members, for your time, your attention, the great questions. We had 20 questions in the Q&A and managed to get through all of them, going a few minutes over. But most of all, Bruce, thanks to you. I don't think I know anybody who can answer any question on Central Asia with this much context, nuance, and really interesting detail. So if there's ever a Central Asia episode of Jeopardy, my money is on you to win it all. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll leave it there. And please stay tuned. There's more from FPRI and RSI coming on Central Asia in the near future. Thank you, everybody.